Imagine a corporation so powerful that it commanded its own armies, waged wars against sovereign nations, and ruled over nearly 300 million people. This isn't science fiction or some dystopian fantasy. This actually happened, and the corporation that did it started with just a handful of merchants seeking pepper and spices. Welcome to the extraordinary and disturbing story of the East India Company, the trading corporation that became more powerful than most kingdoms and changed the course of world history forever. The year was 1600. Queen Elizabeth I sat on the throne of England, and a group of ambitious London merchants had a problem. They wanted spices, silks, and exotic goods from the East, but Portuguese and Dutch traders controlled most of the routes. These merchants decided to do something audacious. They pooled their money, exactly £72,000, and petitioned the Queen for a royal charter. On December 31st, 1600, the East India Company was born. Its official name was Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. Nobody at that moment could have predicted that this small trading venture would one day control more territory than the Roman Empire at its peak. The first voyages were modest affairs. Ships laden with English wool and silver sailed around the Cape of Good Hope toward the Indian subcontinent. The goal was simple: buy spices cheap in the East, sell them expensive in Europe, and make a fortune. And it worked brilliantly. Within decades, the company established trading posts called factories along the Indian coast. Places like Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta became the nerve centers of their operations. The Mughal emperors who ruled India at the time saw these English merchants as harmless traders, useful for commerce but politically insignificant. That was their fatal mistake. Here's where the story gets fascinating. The East India Company didn't just trade goods. It traded in relationships, in manipulation, in playing one Indian ruler against another. India in the 17th and 18th centuries wasn't a unified nation. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, princely states, and territories, all with their own rulers, armies, and ambitions. The company's agents became masters at exploiting these divisions. They offered military support to one prince against his rival. They negotiated favorable trade agreements by bribing officials. They slowly, methodically, expanded their influence not through direct conquest at first, but through something far more insidious: commercial control backed by the threat of force. The turning point came in 1757 at a place called Plassey, a small village in Bengal. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, had grown suspicious of the company's growing power and attacked their settlement in Calcutta. The company sent Robert Clive, a former clerk turned military genius, to retaliate. What happened next would change everything. At the Battle of Plassey, Clive commanded just 3,000 men against the Nawab's 50,000 soldiers. The odds were impossible, but Clive had a secret weapon: treachery. He had bribed the Nawab's military commander, Mir Jafar, to betray his own ruler during the battle. When the fighting began, Mir Jafar's troops stood motionless while Clive's forces decimated the Nawab's army. The battle lasted barely a few hours, but its consequences would last centuries. With the Nawab defeated and Mir Jafar installed as a puppet ruler, the East India Company effectively controlled Bengal, one of the richest regions in the entire world. Think about that for a moment. A private corporation, answerable to shareholders in London, now controlled the taxation, administration, and military of a territory larger than Britain itself. Robert Clive returned to England fabulously wealthy, though plagued by controversy and accusations of corruption. He famously defended himself before Parliament by saying he was astonished at his own moderation, considering the vast wealth at his disposal. The company now had a template for expansion: divide local rulers, install compliant puppets, and extract wealth on an industrial scale. The wealth flowing from India to Britain was staggering. The company took over the collection of revenue, essentially turning itself from a trading corporation into a government. They collected taxes from millions of Indian farmers and craftsmen, money that should have been used for local administration, infrastructure, and welfare. Instead, it flowed into company coffers and ultimately to shareholders in London. The consequences were devastating. Between 1769 and 1770, a horrific famine struck Bengal. An estimated 10 million people, one-third of Bengal's population, died from starvation. The company's policies, which prioritized tax collection over food security and forced farmers to grow cash crops like indigo instead of food, made the disaster immeasurably worse. This wasn't just negligence. This was systematic exploitation creating human catastrophe. Back in Britain, the East India Company had become almost too powerful. Politicians realized that a private corporation wielding this much power was dangerous and potentially uncontrollable. The British government began passing regulations to bring the company under Crown oversight. The Regulating Act of 1773 and later Pitt's India Act of 1784 gradually transferred control from the company's directors to government-appointed officials. But the exploitation continued, now with the official backing of the British state. The company expanded its control across India through a combination of military conquest and cunning diplomacy. The Maratha Empire, the Kingdom of Mysore under Tipu Sultan, the Sikhs in Punjab, all fell one by one. By the mid-19th century, the East India Company controlled almost the entire Indian subcontinent, either directly or through puppet princes. But ruling an empire proved more difficult than conquering one. The company's policies alienated nearly everyone. They interfered with local customs, imposed heavy taxes, and showed contempt for Indian religions and traditions. British officers lived in luxury while Indian soldiers, called sepoys, who made up the backbone of the company's army, were paid poorly and treated with racism. The powder keg was ready to explode. It just needed a spark. That spark came in 1857 with a rumor about rifle cartridges. New Enfield rifles required soldiers to bite open paper cartridges greased with animal fat. Rumors spread that the grease contained cow and pig fat, deeply offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. Whether the rumors were true didn't matter. The sepoys saw it as one insult too many. The rebellion began in Meerut and spread like wildfire across northern India. Sepoys killed their British officers, Indian civilians joined the uprising, and old Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar was proclaimed the leader of the rebellion. For months, the outcome hung in the balance. The siege of Delhi, the defense of Lucknow, and countless battles saw atrocities committed by both sides. The British eventually crushed the rebellion with extreme brutality. Entire villages were burned, rebels were tied to cannons and blown apart, and thousands were executed without trial. The East India Company had survived, but it would not rule for much longer. The rebellion shocked Britain to its core. The government realized that a commercial corporation could no longer be trusted to govern millions of people. In 1858, the British Crown formally took control of India from the East India Company. The British Raj had begun, and India would remain under direct British rule until 1947. The company itself lingered on for a few more years as a hollow shell, managing tea and other trade, before being formally dissolved in 1874. Its 274-year reign had ended. So what's the legacy of the East India Company? The numbers alone are staggering. Historians estimate that Britain extracted approximately $45 trillion in today's money from India during the colonial period. India, which had accounted for nearly 23% of global GDP in 1600, was reduced to less than 4% by the time of independence in 1947. Millions died in famines that were either caused or worsened by colonial policies. Ancient industries like textile manufacturing were destroyed to benefit British factories. The company and later the Raj systematically deindustrialized India, turning a wealthy, sophisticated economy into an impoverished supplier of raw materials. But the story doesn't end there. The East India Company pioneered many practices that modern corporations still use today. It was one of the first joint stock companies where investors could buy shares and limit their liability. It lobbied governments aggressively to protect its interests. It used military force to open markets and crush competition. It prioritized shareholder profits above all else, even human life. In many ways, the East India Company invented corporate capitalism as we know it, with all its power and all its dangers. When we worry today about corporations becoming too powerful, about companies that seem to operate beyond the reach of governments, we're really worried about the ghost of the East India Company still haunting our world. This story matters because it shows how power, unchecked and unaccountable, can corrupt absolutely. It shows how wealth can be built on the suffering of millions. And it reminds us that history isn't just about kings and queens, wars and revolutions. Sometimes history is made by merchants in counting houses, by shareholders demanding dividends, by corporations that see human beings as nothing more than resources to be exploited. The East India Company didn't conquer nations with noble ideals or grand visions. It did so with ledgers and balance sheets, with bribes and betrayals, with the cold calculation that profit matters more than people. The next time someone tells you that corporations are just about business, that they're politically neutral entities, simply providing goods and services, remember the East India Company. Remember that a corporation once ruled a quarter of humanity. Remember that it commanded armies, collected taxes, and sentenced people to death. Remember that the world we live in today, with all its inequalities and power imbalances, was shaped in part by this corporation's 2.5-century reign of exploitation. The East India Company is gone, but the questions it raises about power, accountability, and the relationship between commerce and empire remain as urgent today as they were 300 years ago. If this story captivated you, if it made you think differently about history and power, then subscribe to Imperial Footprints. We explore the untold stories of empires, the dark corners of colonial history, and the forces that shaped our modern world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the past. And let me know in the comments, what shocked you most about the East India Company's story? Did you know that a corporation once ruled India? Share your thoughts, and let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, remember that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here and where we might be heading. Stay curious, stay questioning, and keep exploring with Imperial Footprints.